I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
Prince William thought he understood every boundary his brother was willing to cross. Then Harry made a demand so extraordinary that even the future king struggled to answer. Inside a private Windsor meeting, the Duke claimed he should be allowed to exercise a closely guarded authority connected to the king's birthday honors, an influence reserved for the sovereign himself. William did not argue at first. He simply stared across the table, stunned by what Harry believed he could claim. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William kept his eyes on the page while the silence thickened around the table. The request was not symbolic, and it was not simply a plea for Charles to consider a few names. Harry was formally asking for access to what palace officials described as the king's birthday honors power, seeking temporary authority to submit and personally influence a special group of royal honors without the monarch controlling every final choice. The birthday honors are a ceremonial list used to recognize people for public service, achievement, and contribution, while this fictional restricted power represented the sovereign's protected personal discretion over exceptional nominations. That distinction mattered, because Harry was not asking to be heard. He was asking to participate in authority. Harry watched his brother read the crucial paragraph twice. Only one senior secretary remained nearby, silent enough to make the exchange feel almost private, and the Duke did not look uncertain. William lowered the page slowly and asked whether he fully understood what he was requesting. Harry answered without hesitation. He argued that leaving normal royal duties should not erase his ability to recognize people who had supported veterans, charities, and causes connected to his years of public service. To him, the issue was dignity. To the prince, it was something far more dangerous: whether royal authority could follow a family member after official responsibility had ended. William turned another page and discovered the part that changed the temperature of the meeting. Harry was not merely proposing nominations for Charles to review. He wanted a temporary delegation allowing several names to enter the royal channel under his direct recommendation, giving his choices a status ordinary submissions did not carry. The future king looked up immediately. His brother remained composed, but the argument had now crossed from emotional grievance into a challenge over who could exercise power in the monarch's name. William then noticed one sentence buried near the end. Harry's documented proposal cited an old family precedent suggesting that a senior son of the sovereign could request exceptional honors authority during a period of family transition. The prince circled the wording with his pen. That single line told him this had been prepared carefully, not spoken in frustration. Harry had researched the boundary before stepping across it. William closed the folder, pushed it back toward his brother, and said quietly, "You are asking for something that belongs to the crown, not to us." Harry did not withdraw the request. That refusal made the next decision unavoidable. William would not reject it himself. Charles would see every word exactly as written. But William's shock was only the surface, because behind Harry's demand stood years of resentment over who was allowed to speak, reward loyalty, and still behave as though they belonged inside the royal machine. This was never simply a dispute about honors. For William, the demand touched the future he had spent his entire life preparing to inherit. For Harry, it reopened an older wound, the feeling that every meaningful royal door had gradually closed after he stepped away. Now the brothers were confronting the same question from opposite sides. Was Harry still a royal son entitled to influence, or had that chapter of authority already ended forever? William understood why the argument felt dangerous. As heir, he had been raised to see royal authority as something tied to responsibility, restraint, and daily service, not simply to blood. The role of heir means the person next in line to inherit the throne. But for the prince, it had always meant something heavier than succession alone. Every privilege came with limits. Every public decision carried consequences. Harry saw the same family structure differently. He no longer stood inside the central working monarchy, yet he still believed being the king's son gave him a permanent connection to the institution that schedules, residences, patronages, and ceremonial appearances could never erase. Harry leaned forward during their private exchange and told his brother exactly what had been bothering him. Losing operational royal status, he said, should never have meant becoming invisible whenever the monarchy decided whose service deserved recognition. He spoke about veterans he had met, charitable organizers he had worked beside, and people who had spent years supporting causes once closely linked to his public life. To him, being unable to influence honors felt less like procedure and more like a quiet removal of everything he had once contributed. William chose his words carefully because he knew anger would only deepen the fracture. Recognition granted through the crown, he argued, carried the authority of the sovereign. If Harry could stand outside the working institution while still exercising that authority, the monarchy would effectively create two different definitions of royal legitimacy. One would depend on responsibility. The other would depend on family connection. The future king could not accept both. Harry then revealed through the written proposal just how far he had already gone. Several names were prepared, each connected to veterans, community organizations, charitable work, or long-standing personal causes. This was not a theoretical fight. Real people were already attached to the demand, and that made William's refusal more painful because he knew some of those names might genuinely deserve recognition. William turned to the final pages and felt his irritation deepen. A private legal summary had been prepared weeks before the Windsor meeting, examining old precedents that might support Harry's position. The document showed that his brother had not acted impulsively. He had been quietly building an argument long before placing the demand on the table. William stood alone afterward beside the Windsor corridor window, saddened more than angry now. The folder in his hand no longer felt like paperwork. It felt like another chapter in the slow collapse of trust between two brothers. Then one date on the legal summary caught his attention. It pointed back to a private royal gathering months earlier, and when William traced Harry's argument back to its beginning, he found one ceremony that had transformed frustration into a determination to challenge the palace directly. Months before the explosive Windsor meeting, a smaller incident had changed everything. It lasted only minutes, happened behind closed doors, and was barely noticed outside the palace. Yet Harry never forgot it. During a private reception honoring charitable figures, he watched a nomination associated with one of his oldest causes disappear from consideration, while another royal-backed name advanced. No shouting followed. No public statement came. But according to Harry's later documented account, that was the moment something hardened. Harry had entered the private St. James's Palace Honors consultation, believing one particular name deserved serious attention. He had put forward a veteran support organizer whose work connected directly to causes he had championed for years. An honors consultation is a private stage in which possible recipients are discussed before any final royal approval. And that mattered because reaching the next stage could determine whether a nomination remained alive at all. William had also supported a candidate, this one connected to a national community initiative. Palace officials advanced the prince's recommendation. Harry's disappeared before reaching the final royal review. Harry noticed almost immediately. He waited until the formal discussion ended, then followed a palace secretary into a narrow anteroom and asked why the veteran support organizer had vanished from consideration. The official answered calmly, "Recommendations coming from outside the working royal structure," he explained, "had to follow a different route." Harry stared at him for several seconds. The answer sounded procedural, almost harmless. To the Duke, it felt brutal. Years of service, military associations, charitable campaigns, and public responsibility suddenly seemed capable of being reduced to one sentence about process. Harry called William privately afterward. According to a documented fictional account, prepared following that conversation. He told his brother that the explanation made him feel as though everything he had once done inside the monarchy could now be ignored, simply because his formal role had changed. William did not dismiss the emotion, but he refused to accept the conclusion. The rules, the future king said, could not bend according to family frustration. If one royal relationship created an exception, every boundary around authority would eventually become personal. Harry did not forget those words. The same documented account recorded him asking a far more dangerous question before the conversation ended. Had there ever been a mechanism allowing the sovereign's children to put forward exceptional honors directly? William gave no encouragement, but the question itself revealed that his brother had already stopped thinking about one rejected nomination. Weeks later, Harry received reference to an obscure historical practice involving temporary royal recommendation privileges. He read the precedent broadly. Palace advisors saw it differently, treating the old mechanism as ceremonial, narrow, and effectively obsolete. But by then, the Duke had found what he believed was an opening. Harry left the St. James's Palace reception without finishing his drink. He stopped beside the closed doorway and told his aide, "Then I need to know exactly what they believe I no longer have." That sentence turned disappointment into strategy. Harry would no longer fight for individual names. He would challenge the boundary itself. And by the time Charles finally received his son's formal demand, the king understood that saying no would mean confronting far more than a list of names. The confrontation finally came without cameras, courtiers, or comforting distance. Charles asked Harry to meet him privately, and William entered only after the king insisted that the heir should hear what was being requested in the room where the decision would be made. Harry arrived prepared. Charles arrived wounded, and when the Duke argued that royal blood still gave him a legitimate connection to the honor's power, the king's expression changed from patience to something far colder: disappointment. Charles had already read the written request more than once, before summoning his son to Windsor. He understood that the argument now reached beyond one nomination or one private grievance. William was present because the proposal touched not only the current reign, but the authority he could one day inherit. Harry was asking for what the palace described as a delegated royal prerogative, meaning a temporary authorization allowing another royal to exercise a narrow power normally kept by the sovereign. That distinction mattered, because granting it would not simply allow advice. It would give Harry a formal share in a function belonging to the crown. Harry spoke first. He told his father he was not asking to become a working royal again, and he was not trying to rebuild the role he had left behind. What he wanted, he insisted, was a meaningful way to recognize veterans, charity workers, and community figures whose service might never reach the palace through ordinary channels. Charles listened without interrupting. The king understood the emotion beneath the argument, but he also understood the danger. His son was asking him to separate royal power from the obligations that gave that power its legitimacy. Charles finally answered with painful calm. The worthiness of Harry's nominees was not the issue. The question was whether someone standing outside the working structure could still demand the sovereign's authority whenever family history or personal causes were involved. Harry pushed back immediately. He argued that blood, service, and years spent representing the monarchy could not simply be erased because his formal position had changed. Harry then placed the historical precedent before his father. His advisors had found an old practice that appeared to support temporary recommendation privileges for a sovereign's child. Charles read several lines in silence, removed his glasses, and set them beside the folder. He said the precedent had never been intended to create a second honors channel beside the crown. The Duke did not accept that interpretation. He believed the wording left room. The monarch believed that room was exactly what made the request dangerous. William then revealed what Harry had never been told. Charles had previously considered creating a limited private route, allowing his younger son to recommend charitable figures directly for consideration. The king had abandoned that idea only after learning Harry intended to seek formal decision-making power instead. Harry turned toward his brother at once. Suspicion replaced disappointment. He asked whether William had persuaded their father to withdraw the offer. The prince denied controlling the decision, but the damage was immediate. Charles pressed his hand flat against the folder when Harry reached toward it. "It stays with me," he said, "until I decide." What had begun as a father confronting his son had now become something more dangerous between two brothers. Yet Charles alone could not settle the threat Harry's demand had exposed, because behind the emotion stood a colder question: who actually controlled the machinery that turned royal approval into authority? After the confrontation, the argument moved from family pain to royal machinery. Harry had challenged the king emotionally, but the palace now had to determine whether his interpretation possessed any usable force. William entered the next meeting, expecting a simple legal dismissal. Instead, advisors placed two competing readings of the old precedent before him. One supported the palace's position. The other contained just enough ambiguity to explain why Harry believed he had found an opening. William read both interpretations in silence, aware that the problem had grown larger than his brother. Senior advisors were now asking what would happen if Harry's reading were accepted, and another non-working royal later made the same demand. The modern honors process allows members of the family to recommend deserving people privately, but actual honors authority remains protected because it carries the sovereign's approval. That difference mattered. A recommendation could be considered and rejected. A delegated power could create an entirely new source of royal influence. William's frustration surfaced when one advisor suggested giving Harry a symbolic concession simply to calm the dispute. The prince rejected the idea almost immediately. A vague compromise, he argued, would solve nothing. If the palace created a special exception without defining its limits, Harry could later treat that exception as recognition of a wider right. What looked like peace today could become a much larger fight tomorrow. The future king wanted the boundary written clearly enough that nobody could misunderstand it again. Charles entered the consultation, looking tired rather than furious. He listened while the competing arguments were explained, then admitted something William had not expected to hear. Part of him wanted to give his younger son something meaningful simply because he was his son. The king understood Harry's frustration, and he knew another rejection could deepen the distance between them. William heard the pain beneath those words. For the first time, the dispute felt less like a challenge to royal order and more like a father being forced to choose between emotional mercy and institutional restraint. Charles then received the legal memorandum that made the decision harder. The document explained that the historic wording never imagined a royal child voluntarily leaving official duties while remaining closely connected to the sovereign by blood. That gap created the ambiguity Harry had seized upon. The old precedent was not strong enough to grant him the power he wanted, but it was unclear enough to make his argument understandable. Charles finally reached for the determination. Harry could privately submit deserving names through the same advisory route available to other family members. He would receive no delegated honors power, no independent list, and no right to issue recognition under the king's authority. Charles signed the page, then kept the pen in his hand, several seconds longer than necessary. "I can protect him as my son," he told William quietly. "I cannot protect a claim that weakens the crown." William understood immediately what came next. He had been asked to oversee how the new boundary would be enforced. For Charles, the signature settled the constitutional argument. For Harry, it would confirm the fear that had driven him from the beginning, that William was becoming the gatekeeper of every royal door still left open to him. Harry did not learn the decision from a headline. It arrived privately, in language stripped of drama, and therefore almost more painful. The request was denied. His nominations could still be considered, but the authority he wanted would remain exclusively with the king. Then he reached the final paragraph. William would oversee the palace channel handling future submissions. Harry stopped reading, placed the decision beside him, and understood immediately what that meant emotionally. Harry read the conditions again, because each one narrowed the space he believed he still occupied inside the royal family. Recommendations would remain possible. Every nomination would have to move through the established palace route. No sovereign power would be transferred. That final phrase mattered most. Sovereign power means authority exercised in the monarch's name, not simply influence offered by a relative. And the ruling made clear that Harry could advise but never act as though the crown's authority belonged partly to him. He had asked for a door. Charles had left him a window instead. Harry reacted most sharply to William's new role. The prince would not personally choose every honor or decide which names succeeded, but he had been asked to make sure the special family channel never became a rival source of royal authority. To Harry, the distinction felt almost meaningless in that first angry moment. He told a trusted aide during a private conversation that it now felt as though his brother had been placed between him and their father, guarding the last narrow route, still connecting him to the institution he had once served from inside. William received Harry's response later that evening and felt his own anger rise. He drafted a reply that defended every part of the decision and challenged his brother's interpretation line by line. Then he stopped. The prince reread the message, deleted several of its hardest sentences, and replaced them with something shorter. The rule, he wrote, applied to the power Harry had claimed, not to Harry's worth as a person. William knew the difference might not satisfy him, but he refused to turn a constitutional boundary into another personal wound. Harry's anger shifted when a second message arrived. Charles had personally insisted that his younger son retain some route for submitting worthy names. The king could have closed the channel completely. He had chosen not to. That detail forced Harry to confront an uncomfortable possibility. His father had rejected the demand without rejecting him. Then came the revelation that changed the mood entirely. One name from Harry's original list had already impressed Charles. The monarch had ordered that nomination to continue through the normal process, despite the confrontation surrounding everything else. Harry returned to the determination later, unfolded the page he had pushed aside, and read his father's handwritten final sentence twice. He said nothing. For the first time, he began to wonder whether the real fight had been about exclusion at all, or whether he had confused being heard with being entitled to power. And when Harry finally requested one more private conversation, he did not ask for advisors, secretaries, or even the king. He asked for William alone. For once, there was no legal paper between them. No private secretary waited by the door. No monarch sat at the head of the table. Harry and William met alone, and the silence at the beginning said more than either brother wanted to admit. Harry had spent weeks fighting for royal authority. William had spent those same weeks defending the boundary around it. Now the argument was stripped down to two brothers, trying to decide whether losing trust had become more important than winning. Harry had requested the meeting after learning that Charles preserved his nomination route, and that decision had changed something inside him. William agreed, but only on one condition: no advisors, no secretaries, and no attempt to reopen the formal ruling. The brothers met privately at Windsor, away from the machinery that had shaped every earlier exchange. That mattered, because the dispute had become buried under procedure. For the first time, they could speak without every sentence sounding like evidence. Harry broke the silence first. He admitted that the failed St. James's nomination had humiliated him far more deeply than he had ever said aloud. Watching the name disappear from consideration had made him feel that years of military work, charitable causes, and public service were being quietly erased. He had not only feared losing influence, He had feared losing meaning. To the Duke, the rejected nomination had become proof that the palace no longer saw his past as something worth carrying forward. William listened, then answered with an admission of his own. Harry's demand had frightened him. The prince said it sounded as though royal authority could be taken away from the institution and carried personally by anyone born close enough to the throne. He insisted that his resistance had never been about defeating his brother. It was about protecting a system that could not survive if duty and power were separated whenever family relationships became painful. Harry finally said what William had been waiting to hear. Asking for independent honors power had gone too far. The Duke conceded that point clearly. But he refused to accept that every future contribution from him should automatically be treated as an attempt to reclaim status. He wanted his charitable recommendations judged on merit, not suspicion. William responded with something personal rather than constitutional. He promised that legitimate nominations from Harry would receive the same serious consideration as those submitted by other members of the family. It was not a transfer of power. It was not a new royal right. It was simply an assurance that his brother's voice would not be dismissed before it was heard. Harry extended his hand across the table. William hesitated, then took it. Neither man pretended the damage was gone, but the argument no longer needed to destroy whatever remained between them. Then the outside world caught up. News of Harry's original claim had begun leaking beyond Windsor. The brothers had finally found a boundary they could both live with, but Britain was about to discover just how close the royal family had come to another public rupture. By morning, what had been contained behind palace doors was everywhere. The argument was reduced to one explosive idea. Harry had tried to claim a power belonging to the king. Commentators called it audacious. Supporters called it proof that the Duke still wanted meaningful service. Critics saw something far more dangerous. Yet inside Windsor, William knew the public version was already missing the most important detail. The confrontation had ended differently from the way it began. William watched the coverage with growing concern, because every headline seemed to flatten the dispute into a battle for control. Harry's position had always been difficult to define. He remained the king's son, yet he no longer served inside the central working structure of the monarchy. Buckingham Palace answered with a tightly worded statement, confirming that sovereign honors authority remained unchanged, while family members could still make appropriate recommendations. Sovereign honors authority means the formal power attached to the monarch to approve recognition in the crown's name. And the palace wanted one point understood clearly: influence could be offered, but the king's authority would not be divided. William worried about what the coverage would do to his brother. He had seen how quickly criticism could become personal, and he feared Harry might view the reaction as another coordinated attempt to push him further away. Yet no angry response came. The Duke kept the private understanding they had reached at Windsor and refused to turn the dispute into another public attack. That silence surprised the prince more than any statement could have. Charles felt the cost differently. He sat with the morning coverage in his private sitting room and watched a family conflict become a national argument about loyalty, entitlement, and royal legitimacy. The king had wanted to draw a constitutional line. Instead, the public was now judging the emotional history of both his sons. Then, one front page captured the entire crisis. A fictional morning newspaper appeared beneath the headline, "One Crown, Two Sons," placing Charles between photographs of William and Harry. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered while broadcasters repeated the central question: why had the monarch refused to transfer part of his honors authority? The image made the conflict appear almost irreparable. Charles looked at the newspaper beside his breakfast, studied the photographs for several seconds, then folded the front page inward. He did not ask for more coverage. He asked for the final honors recommendation file. Hours later, the palace quietly confirmed something that changed the mood. One charitable figure originally suggested by Harry was still under consideration. The king had rejected his son's demand for power, but he had not rejected the value of everything Harry brought forward. William understood the significance immediately. The argument had never needed to end with humiliation. Now one final decision remained. The controversy had become public. The authority question had been settled, and Charles was about to choose whether this crisis would be remembered as punishment, reconciliation, or something more difficult than either. In the end, Harry did not receive the power he demanded. William did not surrender the boundary he believed had to survive, and Charles did not choose between his sons in the way many expected. Instead, the king separated two things the family had allowed to become dangerously tangled: love and authority. One could remain personal, the other belonged to the crown. That distinction finally brought the confrontation to an end, and gave all three men a way to leave it, without pretending nothing had happened. Charles confirmed the final settlement, with no room left for confusion. The monarch alone would retain the restricted birthday honors authority, and no independent royal channel would be created for Harry. That authority meant the protected power to approve recognition in the crown's name, and keeping it singular mattered, because the monarchy could not function if different family members began claiming separate pieces of sovereign control. Yet the king did not close every door. His younger son could still recommend deserving individuals through the established family process, preserving a narrow but meaningful path for contribution. William understood the emotional difference more clearly now. His first reaction to Harry's demand had been anger, disbelief, and a fear that his brother wanted to carry royal authority beyond the institution itself. But their private conversation had changed that view. The prince now believed the deeper motive was not a serious attempt to rival the crown. It was Harry's fear that without formal power, everything he had once done would become irrelevant. That did not make the demand acceptable, but it made the wound behind it easier to understand. Harry accepted the ruling without another challenge. The decision cost him pride, yet it also released him from a fight that had begun to overshadow the charitable causes he claimed he wanted to protect. He no longer needed to prove that his voice mattered by demanding the king's authority. If a recommendation deserved recognition, it could survive on merit. Charles then made the decision that gave the crisis its final meaning. One name from Harry's original list was approved through the normal honors process. The king did not approve it because his son had demanded special power. He approved it because the individual's service stood on its own. William personally informed Harry before the decision became public. The Duke paused before answering, then simply thanked him. The message was impossible to miss. His voice could still be heard, but the crown itself could never become negotiable simply because relationships inside the family were painful. Charles closed the honors folder after signing the approved nomination. William stood beside him, knowing the boundary had held. Harry received the confirmation without protest. No sovereign power had changed hands, but something between the three men finally had. Harry entered the crisis believing royal relevance required royal authority. He left understanding that the two were not the same. William discovered that protecting the crown did not require closing every door on his brother. And Charles delivered the hardest verdict of all. A father could still make room for his son, but the king could never divide the power entrusted to the throne. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.